Welcome to Clarion West's Summer Craft Talk series. This year, in the absence of a 6-week workshop, we've asked our instructors to prepare a craft talk for our students and write-a-thon participants. Tonight, Wendy Wagner is our special guest instructor. Wendy is a writer and Hugo-winning editor. She served as guest editor for Queers Destroy Horror and the nonfiction editor for both Women Destroy Science Fiction and Women Destroy Fantasy. She is the managing/senior editor for both Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, and will soon step up as editor-in-chief of Nightmare. Her fiction appears in anthologies and magazines like The Way of the Wizard and Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and she has published 2 Pathfinder tie-in novels, as well as a science fiction thriller, An Oath of Dogs from Angry Robot. Wendy, we are so very glad to be spending the evening with you.
Hi, it's so fun to be here. I'm really excited to meet everyone and just chat all night about writing. I think it's going to be terrific. Yeah. So that was a really terrific intro. Thank you so much, Tegan. I kind of thought I would start by talking about kind of Lightspeed and Nightmare related kind of stuff, and that is about finding writers in the slush pile and kind of what gets us excited about pieces that we find there. You know, the last time we were open for submissions at Lightspeed, we were open for like a week, and I think we got almost or more than 2,000 submissions, which now seems like nothing, because I know that Fantasy Magazine was just open, and they were open for 7 days, and they had like 900 submissions, and Weird Tales was open for like 5 days, and they had 10,000 submissions for one slot. And they only pay 3 cents a word. It's just like mind-boggling, but you know, it's a packed field out there. There's so many writers, and yeah, there's lots of magazines to go around, but we only have so many readers, and we're trying to read as fast as we can. So I just thought maybe we can kind of start by talking about how to get out of the slush pile, because it's hard. I think one kind of, to me, let me kind of say I'm a tiny bit biased, because one of the things that I've been doing at Lightspeed and Nightmare for the last 6 years is I really oversee the slush process. So one of the things that I experience, as well as reading like raw slush, I'm the person that when a slush reader thinks, hey, this story's not bad, it gets passed up to me before it goes to John Joseph Adams. So I tend to see a ton of the stories that are, hey, these stories aren't bad. But even though I have that bias by having this experience of primarily only reading slush that is not bad, I also do read regular slush too. And so I can tell you that like people think a lot of submissions are going to be terrible, but they're really not. I would say, you know, maybe a third of submissions are stories that you read the first paragraph or one sentence and you're like, this is not for me. You know, the vast majority of the stories that we get are, maybe they're fine. Maybe they're a little bit meh, but they're not like rampant steaming garbage that you would just immediately throw in the recycling bin, which is great. It's fun that all these writers are making us work for our selections. So I thought I would say that, you know, there are 3 main reasons that a story gets rejected at Lightspeed and Nightmare. And, you know, there's that very small group where within the first page, you can see real problems with the writing, or you can see that, you know, it's somebody's D&D campaign and they maybe put a few, you know, prepositions in there to kind of connect what happened, you know, or somebody who just hasn't ever tried to make a story make sense on paper. And so those are stories that they get rejected very quickly, and they're very easy for us to look at and know, like, okay, I feel like this isn't going to meet our needs. And then there are a lot of stories that I get about halfway through and I kind of give up on. They're usually stories that have problems or on a structural level where things are not coming together. And so, like, maybe there's a lot of promise at the beginning, but then you just feel more and more let down as you go. And you're like, yeah, it's not going to work for me. And then there are that little group of stories that you do get all the way through, and then you're like, that was the end? Well, that was the end. Why isn't there 3 more pages? Or why did you end that 2 pages ago? Or did you read your story? Did you know what it was about? Because that was not the ending that your story was about. So there's like a very small, little group of stories that we get, and that's what they're like. So I'd say that as we're reading Slush, and I'm particularly the kind of Slush that I see that's been looked at by somebody who's maybe new to reading a vast quantity of thousands and thousands of short stories. So most of those, when those stories come up to me, I see some problems in the middle. And so, like, this summer, I feel like I'm really focused on problems with the middle of things. Like, I just taught a class at Cascade Writers that was about, like, the mushy middle. And so that's sort of my theme for this summer, is the mushy middle. So I'm going to subject you guys to a little bit of mushy middle talk. But I thought, we can also talk about beginnings and endings, because those are, like, really, like, where the yummy stuff, I think, usually happens. But when it comes to mushy middles, I think a big issue with middles is that beginnings and middles, like, your middle has to grow organically from your beginning, right? And if you haven't put a lot of work into understanding what you've done with and what you want to do with your world and your ideas, you can really start to disengage in the middle of your project. Working in speculative fiction, I think that world building and concepts are 2 things that are really, really critical in our work, right? And it's critical in defining the genre. So you need to have a story that has a strong character, and we really can get to what motivates the character, and we're really exploring what's going on inside them. But a powerful spec fic piece is always doing more than just being about particular individuals, because there are particular individuals in interesting, different situations. And so the situation is, like, part of the joy of writing spec fic and reading spec fic. I think, like, some great examples of that, there's this really awesome story by Paolo Bacigalupi. It's called The People of Sand and Slag. The first time I read it, it was collected in John Joseph Adams' Wastelands anthology, but I think it might have been in Clark's World before that, or maybe FNSF, I can't remember. But it is set in a very polluted future on our planet, where people have been bioengineered to be able to eat things like rocks and oil and just, inorganic matter. And yes, the story is really character focused and really character driven. You've got actually fairly horrible people being horrible, doing horrible things, and kind of growing and learning, or not growing and learning. And they're riveting. But what makes that story so especially amazing is the way that the setup of a particular cast of characters and this particular conception of, okay, if humans didn't need to eat organic material, how would that change the way that they look at the world? And let me just say that if you like dogs, you might not want to read this story. But taking that concept, taking that world and digging into it and really unpacking the meaning of the concept that Mr. Bacigalupi came up with is just makes that story just an outstanding speculative experience. And at Lightspeed and Nightmare, like these things are really important to us. Like we love to see spec fiction that feels really speculative, like that John is a big fan of. There's like this like 1950s fan word, Sensawanda. Like it kind of like, it looks really dumb because he spells it like, they spell it like S-E-N. Well, actually, I could type it in chat, but then our people who watch this later would miss it. It's Sensawunda. It looks like, you know, maybe like a shoe company that was being really cute, and it's like the Heelys 2 shoe or something. I don't know. But like John loves that idea, and I do too. Like I love reading fiction that is just like the world is like so yummy, and the ideas are like really digging into like a lot of the things that are like so important to what it means to be a human, and like kind of unpacking like our relationship to the world and the way we think and the way language works and all that stuff. So I really love fiction that's loaded down with ideas and is struggling to make sense of the world and yet also creating new worlds. So that is just a tip if you ever want to submit to Lightspeed and Nightmare. But so I think it's really important as you're working on your story to kind of have an idea of, you know, I often, when I dive into a story, I don't really necessarily have a strong idea of what exactly my world or my characters or things are. I tend to start with a lot of like really, I just have like a weird concept, and I'm like, I'm just going to sit down and try to write something and see if I can get some kind of voice, and yeah, maybe something will come out of that. And for me, that always works. It's like I have like a weird idea, and then I just play around, and then suddenly I have a voice for it, and character just kind of emerges and stuff like that. And so I can write a whole story like that. But I find that once I get to the middle of the story, if I've been writing this sort of organic, experimental, by the seat of my pants kind of thing, then that's where things begin to fall apart. So I feel guilty because some of you have been in some of my other chats this summer, so you've already heard this great quote from Dongwon Song about how you know, the driving engine of fiction is tension. And what is tension more than anything than not getting what you want, not having your needs met? Like on a personal level, I feel very intense and stressed out when I can't get what I need, you know, and I'm sure we all really recognize that right now, when it's a time when, you know, it used to be when you went to the grocery store, if you forgot to get the chocolate chips for the cookies that you were going to make, then it was like really no big deal to be like, hey, sweetie, could you stop at the store and get the chocolate chips on your way home? But nowadays, you know, it's not really quite like that. We're in a time where you're like, I really only want one person in my family to go to the grocery store. You know, maybe Sweetie Pie has like a compromised immune system and you wouldn't want them to ever go near a grocery store. And so now, you know, I can't get the chocolate chips that I need, and I'm kind of like, but I really need chocolate and I really need cookies. And they start getting kind of tense and out of control a little bit. And I think like that is what can make your fiction riveting, is to have characters that are in situations where they have things they need and things they want, and they're being separated from them. And that can be by, their own issues. I love a story where it would be very easy for someone to get whatever they needed if they would set aside some kind of, personal stricture they had, or if they would just get over their attitude about somebody and suck it up and apologize or something like that. And I think those are kind of like some of the most delightful problems in fiction, are the ones that people give themselves. Like, I love that so much. So I think one of the most important things that's going to keep your story being interesting as you're reading along, and interest has got to be like, it's got to be there. I can't just read a story that has like beautiful writing. I mean, as much as I enjoy it, it's like at a certain point, I'm like, well, that was pretty, but I can't see a reason to keep reading. Whereas I have read many works of fiction where the prose was really sort of ordinary, but where there were people who like just were like, so you just couldn't stop reading about them, right? Because they needed something. I mean, I hate to admit it, guys, but I read all the Twilight novels, right? And I didn't just read them like, oh yes, another page. I'm going to read this because I want to know about the state of young adult fiction today. That is important to me. No. I read those books like this gal was lending them to me at work, and I was like, what? You don't have the third book? You lent it to somebody else? And I went to the thrift store and I bought a copy because I was like, I gotta get that in my face holes right now, even though this girl makes no sense and I don't like her. It didn't matter. It was like riveting. I'm sorry. I know it's an embarrassing story, and I'm sorry to subject it to you, but I think all of you are going to have magnificent prose and write wonderfully like poetic lyrical work, and it's going to be magnificent. But let us not forget that there have been some really books that are just full of drivel that are wonderful to turn the pages. I've also read Dan Brown and didn't like it, but yet couldn't stop reading it. It was like so good. So one recommendation I have for you is once in a very great while, like every 5 years, read something that is a mass market hit, that maybe the first page you're like, wow, has this person ever read a book? But if it sold like a bazillion copies, it's worth reading, just because usually those folks got in that position because they are masters of creating tense writing that will make you feel very, very excited about turning the pages. So, these books are just masterworks in somebody wants something and they're not going to get it. And so I think that's something that's important for you to establish on every page of your work, is to have your character wanting something. I know many times I've had work get rejected because they're like, I felt like the main character was just too non-active. They were too passive, yes. And ergo, I just couldn't get into the story. And it's like, many times it's easy to have characters, particularly if they're in terrible situations where they can't like rescue themselves, where they're stuck, where they can't run around, they can't kill anybody, they can't blow anything up, all they can do is sit and plot and stew. It's really easy to have those characters not be exciting, but it's even easier in some ways for people like that to be exciting because they are in a position of great tension. You know, you just need to add like a little sprinkling of hope and a whole lot of wanting, and suddenly you have a character that's like in a terrible position. If you are interested in reading a story like that, I just read a really creepy, creepy story. It is called A Tree, a Wall, or a Person by Matt Bell. And that is also the name of his collection. It might be a tree, a person, or a wall. I get them a little out of order of the three. And it is about a kid who has been kidnapped and is trapped in a room by a creepy person, and it's just him and a albino chimpanzee. And if he tries to move, the chimpanzee will hurt him. And so he's stuck on this bed. So he's not going to be rescuing himself anytime soon. And yet it is a gripping page turner from page 1 to page 14 or whatever. So I think stories like that are a great example of stories that have characters that their situations might keep them from being active in like the sense of they're making an action scene while still being engaged and engaging. That's one thing to think about, is your character being engaged in what's going on. Is that's a verb, being engaged. I mean, may not make for a good sentence, but them being engaged with the world is an activity that can push your readers into exciting new territory. And one thing about characters that I think is sort of under thought about is particularly point of view characters, but all characters on fiction, just the way that they talk about the world and engage with their, like, what they do in the world, even if it's kind of on the small scene, and the ways that their senses experience the world. Those things are really important parts of your character's development. So just like their voice on the page and like what they choose to look at, that can show us a very great deal about what is important to the character and what kind of person they are. So, you know, you might be thinking, gosh, I need to show, like, at all points in time, what is important to my characters. I just think it's really, like, does that mean I need to be saying, like, Jill still really wanted a chocolate chip cookie? Like, is that, you don't need to do that. Like, you know, from like watching film, like, there are many, many times in movies where somebody has a desire. I feel like maybe in the Inglourious Bastards, you know, there's that scene where the bad Nazi captain is interrogating a French peasant, and they're sitting in the kitchen, and we know there's a family sheltering underneath their feet. And it's just like this tense conversation. And, you know, the French farmer at one point, he just, like, his eyes move. He doesn't say, oh golly, there are people under the floor. But of course, like, we realize what it's all about. We know what he wants. And of course, the Nazi captain sees right through all of this guy's, he understands everything that this guy wants. And, you know, there goes the nice family under the floor. And I think actually that whole movie does a great job. Quentin Tarantino is really good at putting his characters in situations where they have desires, and without saying them out loud, you know, they are interacting with their world in ways that reveal their desires. And I think that is really masterful and delightful, and what readers are hungry for, because by and large, readers, particularly with spec fic, I think, they don't need to have like every piece of information like spoon fed into their brain, they're happy to kind of put a little bit of the puzzle together and do a little work themselves. You know, they might need some help from you, but thinking about how things come together is a joy to most readers. I mean, that's 80% of the reason why people read mystery novels, right? To figure it out before the detectives do. So as you're working, think to yourself, what does my character want? And then think to yourself, like, what are the ways I can show it without having them just say it or out loud or think it to themselves or things like that. And the more you put that in, I think the more taut the writing becomes, and the more the world and the people come together in like a truly beautiful piece of fabric. So I would say, like, when I'm reading Slush, that's one of the tip-offs to me. Like when if on the first page, if I don't have a sense of a character having any kind of desire or interest or need, if I can't get a taste of that on the first page, and that's a reason why I reject a story, because I mean, you only have a certain number of pages, and if fiction is all about tension and needs and thwarting those needs, then you need to make every page count in that. So as your story unfolds, pacing becomes very important, and pacing, I think, is trickier in a short story than it is in a novel, and yet at the same time it's also easier. In a short story, you don't have a whole lot of space to work with, right? And so, like, you've got to have your tense intensity, a steadily building thwarting of desires or increased conflict or whatever. And like in a book, it's really easy to kind of get a sense of, okay, things got really tense, and then maybe there's an action scene and it blows up, and afterward there's like sort of like a real relaxing of the tension, because as Dong Wang pointed out, action and tension are opposites, and action releases the tension. So in a novel, and just like in movies, you see, it's really easy to see this in movies, because they're like very, very much more like a modular kind of thing than a novel is. You know, you see, like, okay, the tension is rising. This guy really wants to rob this bank. He has to get this piece of equipment to do it. So he goes ahead and he breaks into a warehouse to get the special tool. And maybe when he breaks into the warehouse, there is a security guard, and they get in a fight. And then afterwards, there's like that, whoo, they made it out of the warehouse. They have the material they need to make meth. Okay, I really like that episode of Breaking Bad. And so then you can have that, like, whoo moment, and that can last for like a little while, and like, you know, the main character can maybe go get some tacos with their buddy, and then they can rehash like some bad stuff from their childhood, and you have some nice character development. In a short story, you don't have that kind of space. Like, the action we just described is like the entire length of your short story. Like, wow, great, that was a really great story about breaking into a warehouse. Cool. I don't. So you have to be more clever and about where you're putting your action scenes, because you don't have a lot of time after an action scene to like ratchet that tension back up and get people all excited again. So I think that's one of the reasons why the vast majority of short stories that you read are kind of like one build up to one action event. And then there's just a tiny little bit of unwinding, and oh, that was the end. That was nice. I really like that, you know. So I think that's something important to think about, is like working through like how you're juggling your tense scenes, you're juggling your action scenes, and you don't need to pack like a ton of activity in a story as long as you've packed a ton of tension into the story. There can be just a ton of front loading of just painful, miserable suffering, of really establishing more and more of what you want. God, those chocolate chips, oh my, I mean, and then the rampage at 7-Eleven can be the end, you know, and then she slides down the wall bleeding, and she's like, oh, I regret this so much. But damn, that was blood, not chocolate. Um, so that's kind of like something to bear in mind, is that short fiction is, there's just like a much more careful juggling of tension that you need, but at the same time it allows you to kind of simplify your kind of plot structure and focus. You can not have to worry about like making like very complicated outlines, and you can just focus more on like this organic connection between your opening and the action that happens and the resolution. So one of the things that makes things tenser is this knowledge of what is at stake. Like, I mean, seriously, like a story where somebody's just like, I really want to make chocolate chip cookies, is not necessarily going to be riveting unless you discover that, you know, maybe her marriage is on the line, and maybe her husband beats her when he doesn't get what he needs, and if she doesn't have those chocolate chip cookies baked when he gets home, then she knows that he is gonna, you know, take out the sock with the soap bar in it and just beat the shit out of her. And so, like, suddenly not having chocolate chips is a lot more important than just me being like, oh, I wish I had some chocolate because today was kind of a stinky day. You know, there's no repercussions of me having a stinky day. There are repercussions to someone who's in a situation like I just described. So knowing what's at stake makes attention so much more important. And I think those stakes might change, and what you want might change as well. In this story about the woman with the chocolate chips, she might start out, she really wants to get the chocolate chips. She's afraid she's going to be hurt if she doesn't have these chocolate chip cookies ready. And so she goes to the local corner store, and she doesn't have any cash left because she spent all the money she had on her groceries. And so she's going to steal them. And maybe she's shoplifting her chocolate chips. It gets caught, and maybe she is a mutant, and the mutants are like, you know, experiencing great violence from the rest of the people. So the shopkeeper is like, what, you freaking mutant? And then he's gonna, like, you know, call the cops or beat her up or both. And so then suddenly maybe her desires and her needs completely change. Maybe she's like, oh, I am now in a situation where I no longer care about these chocolate chip cookies. I just want to get away from this shopkeeper. And so, you know, it's totally fine in a story to have the character's desires and needs and wants radically shift. And that's actually, you know, usually really exciting and fun and cool. But we should really get a sense of what it is. She shouldn't just be like, oh, she shouldn't be doing things that are completely unmotivated and by anything. Like maybe she has said that she's completely nonviolent, and like and then she like just kills this guy for no good reason and takes the chocolate chips. You know, maybe there was never that mutant backstory. Then you're like, wait, I think there's something that wasn't set up at the beginning. I don't understand why. When did she become a killer? If she is a big tough meanie like that, then why doesn't she just like break her husband's fingers or stuff like that? So as your story is going, make sure that like your setup and the things that you've had are shown us that your character believes are remain well, I'm not sure of words anymore. I can't English. Those things should not like change. Like your character grows and develops. They do not just suddenly become like a whole new person in the middle of your story. And so like, it's also, I think, something that's really easy to have happen in the middle of the story or by the end. Sometimes we think we've done a really good job showing like our character changing, having their motivations shift, and the repercussions of the things, the activities in the world. Like, we think we're doing a great job of showing like how this person is developing, but maybe there was stuff we did in our head that didn't make it onto the page. And so like you don't necessarily have a plot hole, but you kind of have like a heart hole. I feel like that is where the services of a wonderful beta reader is like really comes in handy. So one thing that I would recommend that all of you take from your Clarion experience is to kind of stick together, right? Like, you're really lucky. A lot of people spend a lot of time going to conventions and like trying to meet people there and be like, hey, I like your t-shirt, and like you're hoping they'll want to talk to you so you can become friends, you can read each other's stories because that's like the dream. But you guys don't have to do that. You already have a pre-made bunch of friends because you're in Clarion. If you guys stick together and like have each other's backs, you will be like way ahead of most of the other human beings who are writing fiction on this planet. And I think that is like the true wonder of Clarion. It has nothing to do with the people that come and teach you, no matter how amazing and inspiring they are. It is the power of the community, because that's really going to get you through, like not just building your skills, but also saving your butts and your hearts and all that stuff. So establishing like not just that your character has desires, but that there are consequences to their actions, and there are consequences to them not getting what they want. I think I would say like many times, like the difference at Lightspeed between like a level, like a story that gets recommended to me from the Slush Pile, from stories that don't get recommended, like a lot of times the Slush readers put, I can't see what's at stake. So that's just something to keep in mind, that I mean, and I see like really well experienced writers just somehow not even establish that sometimes. So it's just something that we don't always think about. But yeah, having consequences is like really great. So looking at my notes, kind of got out of order a little bit. Sorry. Okay, so as I have been saying, I think that one of the things that's so important about the middle is that it is like taking the ideas and the people that we saw at the beginning and like unpacking them and exploring them in new ways. And so that means that the opening part of your story has to do a tremendous amount of work. And I think we all know that. We all know that you have to like go through that beginning and the first page has to sound like, oh, whoa. And I don't know about you, but I've spent a ton of time sweating over my very first sentences and just like hoping they can sound genius. There's nothing like reading like the opening to anything by Brooke Bolander and then looking at your own stuff and being like, yeah, she makes it look easy. Yep. So I think it's good to kind of talk about what does a good opening do. I mean, first off, as I just established, your right away we need to get a sense of a character that wants something, and but another thing that's really important about openings is that you should have a good sense of the world that this character is living in. And I don't mean that you need to have like every little bit of world building detail that you've come up with. That doesn't need to show up in the first paragraph. Like, you know, if you've read it's by James S.A. Corey. If you've read the Expanse series and heard the mythology, you all know that Ty Frank had like 10 binders of background like information about the worlds of that and his stories and everything like that. Like 10 3-inch snapping folders ready to go because he was going to make, an awesome RPG. And you don't need 10 or 10 binders worth of information to be sucked into the first book of the Expanse, right? You just open up and you see that girl and she's in like Claire. I think her name is Claire. No, I don't know. The gal, and she's, in this terrible situation on this ship. And she's all by herself. There's weird stuff going on in the engine. And you're immediately sucked in and you immediately have a sense of the world. And you don't need all the political background then, but Clarissa, that is her name. Her name is Clarissa. Yeah. So Clarissa, like she's just waking up and, like there are smells in the air and there are textures right away. So very quickly we have this sense, okay, we're in a world that is about where people go to space. We're in a situation where somebody is on a spaceship. Spaceship still like, it's not like the kind of future where spaceships are magic. They're not self-sustaining. They need people to take care of them. It's very gritty. And so immediately we have this sense of what the world is and how the kind of dangers that she might be in. And I feel like that is just a wonderful example of a hard science fiction story that easily, without using a lot of crunchy terminology, and while still being very, very grounded in this young woman's head, it does a great job of establishing some rules of the world right off the bat. And I think, we are beings that evolved in a biological space, right? So we get a lot of information about what creatures want and what creatures need based on basic facts about biology. And so in your opening, if your character has a different or special biology, I think it's kind of that's kind of great to get out there pretty early on. It can be so unique and engaging and give us reasons to focus on the world in new and interesting ways. Also, if they're biologically very similar to us, but they're in a world that is extremely different and challenging, like a spaceship or like another planet where the air might be poisonous, or another dimension where maybe you're being like it's a two-dimensional world and you're being squashed into a flat item and your brain can't even handle the cosmic and unimaginable alternate way of being in the world that excludes the third dimension. it's great to kind of lay that out as early as possible, because I think like we as readers are kind of grumpy when like 3 pages later you're like, wait, this was like a flat world the entire time, and that's why you couldn't walk across the room because there's no across. It would have actually been a lot more exciting if I knew that from the beginning. So I think like that's an important kind of some, just like the rules of your world, just without spelling them out. It's good to kind of have a sense of them very early on. And so your opening should like have your if your character is engaging with their world, that information will come across very quickly. Like if your character is just standing there, then it's hard to make a discovery that there's no gravity. So when they walk, they're bouncing around or something like that. So if you just have a character that's like doing stuff, it will probably come across some of the basic rules of your world, and start getting that world, expressing it in a little bit better in that water break. Another thing to think about is like, where do you start your story? And I think that is something that as a writer, we wrestle with a lot, right? You know, readers, they get to jump into the right spot because somebody picks it out for them, but they will know what the right spot is when they read, because readers are there for the story, whereas writers, we're not necessarily there for the story. There's a lot of other things that are motivating us to write a project, and it might be part of, I'm sitting down today to write to learn more about this character. I'm sitting down today to write to, figure out what happens in Act 1, and so I'm going to do some experimental writing, or, all this other stuff. And so a lot of the time we start writing a project, and it's before the real story has shown up. I'd say many stories, which are excellent stories, the kind of story that might get a rewrite request, is a story that I might say, this story starts on page 5. And I can't tell you how many stories get rejected that say that. This story starts on the 2nd page. This story starts on page 10. And so that opening should be, the story should start at a point when the character situation and the world situation are being forced together. Like, you've heard that expression, get in late, get out early. And that's particularly, I think, in short fiction, is a great thing to do. And sometimes you can almost go through your short story after you've written it and like play and like cut off the first scene and be like, was that really doing anything? And maybe that's a scene you wrote and you loved, and you're like, that totally established the world. It totally showed us how hilarious and clever the main character is. And it's just so great, and I should never cut it because it's brilliant. But then when you go back through after you're done and you have a really good sense of what the story is about, and like how the world and the character are confounding each other, at that point you might look at that first scene and you might see the ways that it's not like the problem hasn't really started to push into your character, and the character isn't yet ready to show off what they're wanting. And so a lot of times if you're wrestling with a story, or if a story's come back rejected several times, look at your beginning and think, if I cut off the first paragraph, is it better? Like, if I take out the first scene, is it better? If I cut off the first 5 pages, is it better? And you know what? One of the tip-offs I have discovered for many writers, the fact that they have not quite reached the point where they're ready to engage the character into the story, is that the writing tends to be much more mediocre in those Sorry, I thought the cat was about to step on the power bar. The writing tends to be like, it can be really beautiful, but it's also like it just feels not as exciting and not as tense and tight. I see that all the time in my work. I see that all the time in like other writers too. It's like there's a total taste of the work that changes, like a whole different flavor. It's like you didn't have enough salt. And once the story really starts, instantly the prose changes its quality. I would say if you have written something and you're like looking back on it, and you're like, wow, there are a lot of, I somehow put in more sentences that are in the passive voice than I would normally do. It might be a tip-off that you started too early and that scene is not really like doing what you want it to do. That's just like a weird thing that I've noticed. Maybe it will not work for you. It might not be relevant at all, but I think, you know, it's a good trick to have in your repertoire if you're struggling with revising the opening to a story. Another thing about your opening is that it helps if it's doing something that's like a little bit different or unexpected, or it somehow catches your reader by surprise, right? And so like I had a story, it's a horror story, and it's going to come out in Pseudopod in like November or something. And I really, really, really liked this story. I thought it was terrific. And it got a 20-minute rejection at the dark. And I was like, well, that stinks. But then I was also like, I wonder if there's anything I can do that could shake up my first page of this story and see if I can make it just pop just a little bit more. And when I was writing this story, the only thing I knew about it was I had this line in my head, and it was, they said they were vampires. Sometimes I believed them, and sometimes I didn't, but I didn't really care. And so that was what started the story for me. And that's what got me to write this whole story, was this line. So of course, it's the first line of the short story. But then thinking about it, just for fun, I'm like, what if I swap the first two paragraphs of this story so that now it says, I looked up when Carlos came in with a girl, 2 Domino's pizzas, and a bag of marijuana gummies. And when I did that, I felt like suddenly there was a sense of the world. Like it definitely had a very contemporary feel and a grungy-ish feel, and I just felt like, oh, you know, maybe that first line is actually more interesting, because then I can continue describing the space they're in. And like the rest of the paragraph goes on describing about this basement that this girl is in. The story is called The Smell of Night in the Basement, so you know it's going to be in a basement. And, you know, it's like the first paragraph is now, like, here are the first 2 paragraphs. I looked up when Carlos came in with a girl, 2 Domino's pizzas, and a bag of marijuana gummies. It was a big basement, finished in places, dirt in others, a kind of half-assed bathroom in the corner with no walls or a door for privacy. You got used to smelling somebody drop a deuce or rinse blood out of their hair in the utility sink. They said they were vampires. Sometimes I believed them and sometimes I didn't, but I didn't really care. I got enough to eat. That goes on a little bit. But I realized, like, having this sense of like a regular place with like normal things, but like horrible things, and then rolling into the vampires was suddenly doing something that was much like less, it created more surprise, and it was just a little more interesting than starting with the vampires and then explaining, you know, they're getting blood out of their hair, right? I mean, they're vampires, they're messy eaters. Probably before they were vampires, they dumped like milkshakes on their head. So I think that's something fun to play with as you're writing. Like, what's a great way to show off my world and show off my character, but maybe also have a little bit of a surprise. You know, like you've got a portal story. It doesn't need to start by opening the door to the wardrobe. You know, it could start someplace just a little bit more unexpected. Maybe it starts with you grabbing your fur coat because you're going to go on a heist, but your arm passes through it. You know, who knows where it starts? But I think the element of surprise is really underrated in writing, and yet it is one of the most wonderful joys of being a reader. Just like always really fun to have work set up expectations and then sort of challenge it. Like, oh, this is a story about druggies who live in a basement. Oh, actually, vampires. Okay, cool. Or, you know, in The Expanse, you're like, okay, this is the story of a gal who's got problems with her spaceship. Where there's a horrible alien thing that's taking over the universe. Okay, whatever, you know, or there's just so many great ways to kind of subvert your expectations of what is going to happen. And if you get a chance, roll with that. Just subvert those expectations and mess with your reader a little, because I mean, that's what they're there for, is to be messed with, right? Let's see. Another thing that is nice in our work, I think, in Specfic is like, it's really nice to kind of get a sense of the genre early on, you know? Like, people who read genre fiction are looking for genre fiction. So it's kind of okay to like give them like a little like, oh, you like that fantasy sugar? Here's some sugar, baby. Like, give it to them. They deserve it. You're going to be messing with them a lot in this story. So give them the occasional taste of something that they like, you know? So, you know, that is one really nice advantage to, you know, once again, The Expanse. It doesn't start on Earth in a boardroom. It could have, right? Like, it's a super political work. Everything is all about the politics of Mars and Earth and OPA and all that stuff. But they were like, if we started in a boardroom, people might think this is like, I don't know, like a legal thriller. Let's start it on a spaceship. And that was a good choice, because then the people that are like, I like sci-fi, are like, oh, thank goodness, it's science fiction. There's a spaceship. You know, if you're going to be crossing genres, then you could want to give somebody a taste of both genres at the same time, or you might like back off a little, and then that might be like a surprise later. Ha ha! There were really unicorns driving the spaceship the whole time, and that's cool too. Because then it's like, as long as it's like a happy surprise that you sort of set up a little, you're like, that was why there was like, you know, unicorn poop on the floor, like that sparkly stuff was unicorn poop. This all makes more sense. Whereupon, like, if there hadn't been glitter and confetti, it might not like be set up so well, and then you might just be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah, so like getting the genre out there and having a flavor of that genre is really nice. And I think, you know, like mysteries are a great example of this, because mystery has I feel like there's a lot of like really well-defined subgenres within the mystery category. And I feel like most mystery writers do this amazing job of letting you know on page one what kind of mystery you're going to be reading. But the funny thing is that almost all mystery novels seem to start a lot, well, okay, maybe not almost all, but like I'd say 60% of all mystery novels start with a scene with somebody discovering a dead body or somebody getting killed. Like a lot of mystery novels, particularly darker ones, are going to start with a chapter that's told from the point of view of a victim, and they're going to get offed, and then the next chapter is going to jump in with like the main character. But even though these mysteries are starting with very similar, like this textbook, oh look, I just found a dead body, or oh, I'm gonna be a dead body, you can tell like, oh, this is a cozy mystery, or dang, I thought this guy was in America, but clearly this was written by a Norwegian. You know, those Norwegian mysteries, they're their own thing. And or like, you know, police procedural is going to have a totally different flavor, and Tana French will do her own thing. And so I think like kind of thinking about the way that your genre presents itself and the way that that feels good to you and what draws you to that genre. That's where you're kind of like everything in your work should really be sort of residing in that. Like a lot of people, you know, I write a lot of horror and I work with a lot of people who write Lovecraftian fiction, right? Like, I mean, I live in Portland. I go to the HP Lovecraft Film Festival. There's just a lot of us who are into this stuff here. And there are definitely like, everybody has their own stance in that community on how they're going to relate to that subgenre and what about it rings true with them and what they want to challenge and what they'd like to get away from. And I think all of us in genre fiction that's like kind of like why we're in it, is to revel in the stuff that is really meaningful and important to us, and to push away the things that don't mean things to us. Like, I mean, science fiction has this very long time period in the middle of it where it was really very much like a Western that was having an adventure on another planet, right? Like it's a guy, maybe he's law enforcement, maybe he's a stranger from out of town, but this dude is going to come and he's going to have some adventures. Maybe he's going to have a horse or a dog, or whatever the horse or dog is in analog is in this science fiction world. And he's going to save the natives. And luckily the natives are going to look enough like him that he can, you know, get it on with one of the gals. And, you know, for most of us writing science fiction now, like that is something that we're going to be pushing away from. We are like, that's over and done with. But there are these other things about science fiction, even those classic science fiction stories, that we might want to hold into our heart. Like, I mean, there is like great stuff to be said for the sense of adventure and having a story that plays up the dangers of a foreign place and really revels in that sense of the unfamiliar. And so, like, you know, you might read these older works and find yourself thinking, there's stuff in here that is for me, and there's stuff in here that is not for me and is hurtful to me and that I reject. And, you know, I write Lovecraftian stuff. I've got Cthulhu on me right now. So, you know, there's many things about his work that I do regret, that I do push away from, and that I do find hurtful, and that I would never want to include in my own work. But, I mean, tentacles, yeah. So that's kind of like our place in science fiction, fantasy, and horror, is kind of a digression. You know, sometimes people who are unfamiliar with genre will write in genre, and sometimes they create something that's really new and exciting, and sometimes they'll create something and like okay, I did not read Colson Whitehead's zombie novel because I read the first couple of pages and I was like, I'll get to this later, and then I had to take it back to the library. So it's still on my to-read list. But, you know, I remember listening to like a big conversation about it. And, you know, a lot of the people who had read it were saying, well, the writing was wonderful and I loved the characters, but I felt like all the actual zombie stuff was stuff that had been done over and over again by other people working in genre. And so I think like that is a risk that can happen if you're working in a genre that you don't naturally gravitate toward, or that you haven't like fallen in love with. And like that's like the great thing, I think, and that like if you're not willing to revel in, I'm a science fiction novelist and I'm gonna work in science fiction and I'm just gonna dig in and make it my own place. Like I feel like we're really lucky to get to work in a genre where you know, I think it's always ready to be reinvented. I think, you know, like I love mystery novels, but I don't know if I'd ever like want to be a full-time mystery novelist because I just feel like it's just a lot harder to subvert like that genre. I mean, I might be wrong. Maybe mystery writers right now are saying, God, I love subverting this genre. It is so great. But I just feel there's like an incredible, like even though we're standing on the shoulders of giants, there's still so much room for us to like make our own space and show off our own voices and carve our own new like paths, you know. I think we're really lucky. And I think that's what we should be doing. Like be yourself in these when you're writing. Like don't try to be anybody else. Just be you and make your stories like the most you they can be, you know. And because like that's our jobs, is to take from the big pot but to add our own seasonings, you know. I'd say like if there are 3 things I could just like instill in every writer before they submit it to Lightspeed, it would be challenge yourself to create surprises in your writing, whether that's like digging into your stories, opening and trying to find a way to make it really like, oh my, that wasn't what I was expecting. Or maybe as your story is unfolding, maybe you're digging into a classic trope in a new way, or maybe you have an ending that has spun things in a new direction and shown us like that we didn't really understand like something in the world, or maybe we misunderstood something about the characters' motivations. You know, those kind of things. I mean, they call them a twist ending, but I think like just thinking them as sort of like creating a surprise can be more effective way to think of it. And I think everybody loves it when they've created a surprise, but like a surprise you could have figured out, not like something totally out of the blue. I think that is just a huge win for people that really can help them get out of the slush pile. And like, so that's the first thing I would tell them. And then the second thing is like find a variety of ways to show on the page, like what characters Riot want, what's at stake, what is the problem between like what is keeping us from winning and succeeding and being happy, like just experimenting with like finding lots of different ways to make us feel that on the page. And then the last thing is getting back to just write something beautiful and true, like something that only you can write. And I just think that is like what separates a story that is a good story from a great story. You know, all of us have, I mean, many of us have led extremely ordinary, boring lives, right? I mean, oh my gosh, I'm a middle-aged woman and I live in suburbia. You just don't get much more boring than that, people. But at the same time, I think there are things about the way that I have looked at the world and ideas that I have about us and animals, or I don't know. I think I probably have some good ideas that are worth sharing with the world, and I've thought things that nobody else has ever thought. And that's not because there's something incredibly special about my brain. It's just because your brain and your thoughts come out of like so many billions upon billions of differences about you. Biologically, there's nobody just like you. Even if you're a twin, your eyes work a little bit different than your twin does. Your sense of smell works a little bit differently from them, especially if you had a lot of colds. You can't smell anything anymore, right? Totally different. Your taste buds are different. And your brain has developed differently over like all your experiences. And so there are truths that you know that you can express that can help people see things in a whole different way than they've ever thought before. And when you think about that, that's like amazing. You can make people think things they've never thought before. That's kind of what our jobs are. I'm even tearing up. I'm so excited about all these great ideas you guys are going to have, and how many amazing, like, new ways of being there will be in the world because of your work. So that is what I think is probably going to be the end of my craft talk. It's a little bit on the shorter side than I was hoping for, but I think just remember that. Don't let, it is really, really easy to like start feeling kind of down, and like every kind of story has been written before, and that, you know, you might see somebody have a book sale and they're like, oh my gosh, that was my idea. That is my novel right there. One, I give up. I'm going to throw it away. But that novel and your novel are going to be so different. It's like, you know, Jane Yolen. She had a book about a magic academy. One of the students had red hair. You know, the kid who wound up going there had no magical background, and then he went to the magic academy. And then, you know, like 10 years later, some other lady shows up and she writes this book about a magic academy, and the kid comes from a background with no magic, and his best friend has red hair. I mean, these books are so, like, if you were like, oh my gosh, there's already a book about kids with red hair and magic, then, you know, you might give up and throw away your book. But, you know, obviously these two novels, Magic Academy, I can't remember what it's called, by Jane Yolen, and Harry Potter, are absolutely different. I mean, absolutely different things to the people that read them. So don't worry if you sometimes feel like an uninspired hack who's using like all the same ideas that have come before. It's okay if you want to write a zombie novel, even if there have already been a billion zombie novels. It's okay if you want to write a novel that is about people who are going to settling in space, and they're having a lot of internecine wars between Earth, Mars, and like people that don't live on those planets. Because, you know, you're gonna write something that's very, very different from those guys, because you have like a totally different truth inside of you. So focus on that. You are gonna be so great, and just stick together and keep on keeping on. I guess that's it for me tonight, and maybe we can go to Q&A after this.